Hey folks, Matt Easton here. So this is a little bit random, but I often get questions, random questions under videos. Sometimes they're old videos on my channel, and sometimes those questions actually give me something to talk about in a future video. So by all means, keep asking questions. I actually love getting questions. The better thought out, if you think about something that might make a good video, that kind of question, that's the kind of question I like. I'm sorry that I don't get the time to answer all questions. I need probably an office of staff to be able to do that, unfortunately, which I don't have, but maybe one day. But so the question was, it was specifically in regards to this helmet actually. So these are the helmets which I have shown previously. This is a Norman style helmet. It was actually based on the St. Wenceslas helmet, which I think is in Prague. But this is available from the Night Shop, which I've put the links to. In fact, I'll put a link below this video where these helmets are from. These are really, really good. But the question was, what type of metal or steel, but I'll get into that in a second, what kind of metal is it made of, and is it historically accurate? Well, to answer the first bit's easy. This one's mild steel by modern standards. And is it historically accurate? No. But, and here's the but, and you know, I like the but on this channel. The but is that mild steel is roughly equivalent in terms of its performance qualities to a lot of the steel, and I'll get into the question of iron or steel in a second, that was used in medieval armour. So if you analysed, if we had 20 or 30 Norman helmets, then you would find there'd be a variation in their material. But the way that they would perform in mechanical terms would, for the most part, be roughly equivalent to a mild steel helmet for this period of armour. In contrast, if we go to my later 15th century armour, so I don't, the Sallet's over there actually, but I just got my arm harness to hand. So my arm harness for my 15th century armour is made of hardened medium carbon steel. Now, let's just break those terms down for a second. So in modern terms, you've essentially got iron. Then when you get to certain, I won't go into the percentages because you don't need to know that really for the purposes of this video, but when you get a little bit of carbon in your iron, it becomes mild steel. Now, what defines mild steel is basically it's not hardenable, at least through heat treatment, through quenching. You can work harden it, but anyway. And there are other ways you can slightly harden it, but generally speaking, if you heat it up to red hot and plunge it into some oil, it won't become hard and brittle, as you might have seen on shows like Forged in Fire. The steel that does that is usually known as carbon steel. And that's because it has enough carbon in it that it is hardenable. Okay, so we have this term for mild steel, and in the modern world, mild steel is one of the most easily accessible metals and cheapest metals to buy. Certainly in the UK it is. It's used in car bodies, it's used in construction. Most things like nails, you know, for hammering into wood are made of it. Basically, mild steel is kind of the default go-to steel for the construction industry. Unless you need something which is stronger and is able to take more forces, then you go into the medium and the higher carbon steels that may or may not be heat treated. But anyway, but in the medieval world, they didn't have modern steels. And so the basic answer is the steel that this is made of historically accurate? Technically, no, it's not. Because modern made steels are cast steels. That is, they have been melted down and then solidified so that the impurities that are wanted to be removed are taken out. The impurities that they want to put in for alloying purposes, so carbon, you might put some nickel or chrome or vanadium or whatever else into the steel, are added in. And they are cooled gradually, so you don't end up with a cast iron type thing. But they're essentially things that have been liquefied and then made into the exact steel that you want. So when you look at steels, you might have, you know, 1045, 1065, 1095, 5160. CR, whatever, you know, the letters and the numbers usually designate amounts of carbon or other metals or elements that are put into the steel. So if you have a CR, that usually indicates chrome, I believe, and if you have an N, I think it's nickel, and obviously some of these equate to what would commonly be called stainless steels, although that's also somewhat complicated, and what qualifies as a stainless steel depends on the exact amount of chromium usually that's put in there. But basically there are alloy steels, and then there's kind of purer carbon steels, then there's mild steel, then there's iron. Now, medieval armour, medieval swords, what were they made of? They were made of bloomery produced iron and steel. So quite simply, the steel that they made weapons and armour out of in the medieval period hadn't been melted for the most part. Okay. Now, when we talk about crucible steels, what they are steel that has been melted and purified, or certain things removed and certain things added, and then solidified again. And so the famous Ulfbert swords, for example, they are crucible steel swords. Wootz steel is crucible steel, and that is steel that has been liquefied and solidified. Medieval swords, I'll just grab an Albion here. Medieval swords were by and large made of bloomery steel, although they did start to, towards the end of the period, they did start to use some steels which were produced through other means, which I won't go into here, that did mean that they were somewhat more reliable and better quality steel. But that's another topic. So I don't want to go too far into the technology of this, partly because, and you know, I fess up here, I don't understand all of it. Okay, so for anyone who said, oh, you didn't just explain that right, I'm sorry about that. This is purely just a quick, simple explanation for the layman. So bloomery steel is quite different to modern made steel. Modern made steels are different, and importantly, so you should know, pretty much no modern artifacts, unless you specifically go to there are particular sword makers who can do this, or armour makers who are actually making bloomery steel and making steel from scratch the original way. Unless you specifically commission that kind of work, when you buy armour or swords or anything else, doesn't matter how you know, like even if they're an expensive Albion or whatever, they are made with modern metals, and they are not the same material as the original artifacts. The original artifacts have more inclusions of slag and other impurities, so you can see a structure to the steel usually. Sometimes you might have certain, in armour, for example, you sometimes see delaminations because of the way that the steel has been produced, and then subsequent corrosion or polishing can expose those cold shuts, essentially. Or it can be that the slag sometimes comes out in corrosion, and so you're left with a void which was previously filled with an inclusion. So modern steels are much, much more reliable and much more homogeneous and predictable as well. And of course, therefore, when you heat treat them, you get a very even heat treatment. If it's done right, of course, you get a very even heat treatment. So the hardness of an Albion sword should, on paper, be the same hardness all the way along this edge, whereas a medieval sword, if you tested it, you might find that it's irregular along the edge because there are irregularities in the material. So even human error, or the process of hardening and quenching the steel and tempering it, even human error aside, in the material there is variation, which means there will be variations of hardness. So therefore, yes, you get mechanical failure more often in historical artifacts. Historical sword blades are more likely to break. Historical armour is more likely to break, or collapse or bend or whatever, because modern steels are just basically better, okay, for the most part. Final thing I want to say is that some of the steels used in modern replicas, even high-end ones, or relatively high-end ones, are quite far removed from the type of material used in the originals. An example is the the fittings that are used, for example, on Albion swords, the guards and the pommels, I don't know precisely what steel they use for these, but it is not a simple mild steel. I know that because I've tried bluing Albion fittings, and it blued the peen of the blade, which is the tang coming through, but it would not blue the pommel. So there's some alloy in there. I suspect it's nickel steel or something like that. That makes these not quite stainless steel, but something in that direction. So the hilt fittings are made of quite an unhistorical metal. The blades are made of an unhistorical metal, although it's an alloy carbon steel. So usually, I know 5160 is used a lot for sword blades these days. If we just swap over to the Dark Sword Armory sword here, I know that this blade's 5160. 5160 is relatively different to medieval steels, but the performance it's more reliable. It will keep a better edge for longer. It's less likely to break, blah blah blah, than a medieval sword. But if we take the best performing medieval sword, it would still cut things. It would still feel the same. It would perform in pretty much the same way as a good quality modern replica, but the modern steel is better. In terms of the fittings, I think that Dark Sword Armory are actually using mild steel. Certainly their fittings have the look of mild steel to me. Now, mild steel, is that more accurate for hilt fittings? Probably yes. In some cases, even iron is actually probably more historically correct for hilt fittings. And someone like Paul Binns, for example, who, as you know, I have a few swords from Paul Binns, does use wrought iron sometimes for hilt fittings, where you can actually see the structure, and that's probably a little bit closer. And sometimes he uses antique, so someone like Fabrice Cognot sometimes uses antique wrought iron, which is produced in a way that's more similar to medieval ways. So you get the look, you can actually see there is a structure and irregularities within the metal itself. If we go to another manufacturer here, so this is Dynasty Forge, their hilt fittings look very much like stainless steel to me, and I suspect that they are. I'm not completely certain, but I suspect that their fittings are stainless steel. And personally, to me, to my eyes, I find that a bit offensive. Stainless steel has a colour, and certainly various alloy steels have a colour which doesn't really look like the type of steel that usually would have been used in medieval weapons. And I have to say, I find that a little bit with Albions as well. Albion hilts have a slightly bluey grey tinge, a bit like Deltin can do as well. So that's a Deltin behind me. Deltin blades have a kind of grey bluey colour to their blades, and it's a vanadium steel, nickel vanadium steel, I think, the alloy that they use for their blades. And it's good, it works well for blades, but it has a strange hue or colour to it that the originals tend not to have. And I find that similar with the hilt fittings on Albions. And of course this can go through to, if we come full circle, back to armour as well. And in some ways you might even find that it's even more important with armour. And so in a funny sort of way, humble old mild steel, although these days with the rise of HMB and all of that kind of stuff, carbon steel armour, hardened carbon steel armour has become very fashionable because there's less maintenance involved, it's tougher, and it doesn't get dented so easily, and you can make it lighter as well. You can have the same strength but with thinner plates, so you can make it lighter. Some people are using titanium and other sorts of materials, which of course is completely non-historical, but it does work as armour and it's lighter and stronger. But actually old-fashioned mild steel, in many ways, for a lot of armour for the medieval period, is actually a really good material to use because it has the right colour of a fairly natural kind of low-carbon steel. And if we look at a lot of historical armour and analyse, well, what's this actually made of, it's got some carbon in it. It's not just pure iron, it's got some carbon in it. But a lot of historical armour doesn't show any signs of having been heat treated, and perhaps doesn't even have enough carbon for it to be heat treated. So actually mild steel, is it historical? Not technically, no, because it's a modern steel, but actually mild steel's a pretty good analogue for a lot of things if you're making medieval replicas, for hilt parts, for bits of armour, for buckles, for all kind of, rivets, brigandines, all this kind of stuff. Carbon steel obviously has its place for blades. Alloy steels, every maker has to make their own decision. How far away from the origin are they going to go? In Britain, there's been a long-standing tradition of using EN45, which is a Sheffield produced steel for blades, and actually EN45 is a fairly straightforward carbon spring steel, as I understand it. Some other alloy steels that are used for blades these days are gradually going further and further away from the type of carbon steels, or even a rough analogue for the type of carbon steels that would have been used originally in sword blades. Does it matter? That's up to you. Personally, I quite like things that are as reasonably similar, without going to colossal expense, as reasonably similar to the originals as possible. But I accept that we're not going to be doing the bloomery process affordably and making armour and weapons out of it. And even if we did, then modern people would complain about the fact that their swords break more often, because let's face it, historically made swords would break more often than modern made swords. Anyway, there we go. Sorry if the science bit's a bit sketchy. I'm not a metallurgist by any means. I'm not a bladesmith, and I only have a sword collectors and antique dealers cursory understanding of the metallurgy here, but I think most of what I've said will give you a rough idea of where we stand on how accurate are modern replicas in metallurgical terms compared to the originals. Thanks for watching. Give us a like and subscribe, and I'll see you soon for another video. Cheers, folks!
Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.